So in 1958, the Oxford historian and archaeologist William Pantin delivered an important paper to the recently formed Society for Medieval Archaeology, outlining a common sense but nevertheless significant viewpoint that material remains and the written record should be complementary, not mutually exclusive sources of evidence. Warning us against privileging documentary evidence at the expense of material remains, he offered these wise words. He wrote, "It is fallacy to suppose that archaeology stops or becomes less useful when historical and documentary records begin. In other words, that archaeology is essentially prehistoric. On the contrary, the more we have documentary sources to help us, the more we can hope to get out of material remains, and vice versa." So Karen and I are here to present a case study today, which I think rather vindicates this position. For here, graffiti evidence fills a gap in the written record, but it also provides us with a way forward for mining various scenes of ancillary documentary evidence. It also aptly demonstrates how the kind of work that many of you are doing, locating, photographing, recording historical graffiti, it can have a transformative effect on the work of someone like me. So I should introduce myself. I'm a music historian. My research particularly focuses on the development of the music profession in England between the Reformation and between the Civil War. And the music trade, like any other profession, was embedded in much broader social and family networks and rooted in evolving models of educational practice. A lot of my earlier work has concerned instrumental tuition in elite households, in the university colleges, amongst mercantile circles. But I've also had a secondary project on the go for quite some time, surveying the music profession in the southern provincial city of Winchester. A number of musicians I was already working on had Winchester connections, and it's always nice to be doing archival work when the sources you need are in your home city, of course. So I was quickly able to put together an image of the urban music profession in Winchester between around 1560 and 1620, and doing that using the standard tools of the archival historian. So parish registers, the cathedral chapter acts, wills in the local record office. The findings were quite interesting, although perhaps not totally unexpected, basically showing how professional musicians, by which I mean mostly singers, tended to operate within family and social networks, very much centered around the cathedral, which you can see right at the center here. This is Winchester Cathedral. And like so many other early modern trades, being a musician was very often a family affair. Now, as the cathedral emerged as the focal point in my study, I found surprisingly little overlap with the musical staff just outside the city walls, and unfortunately obscured on the screen, but here at Winchester College. And there's another enigmatic institution a few more 100 meters down the road, so down Kingsgate Street here, just off the bottom of the map, is the Hospital of St. Cross. It's an almshouse founded in the 1130s by Henri de Blois, and it provides accommodation to this day for 13 elderly inhabitants and sustenance for additional non-residents every day as well. So the original, the site on the on-site church at St. Cross was conceived on quite a grand scale, as you can see from the photos, and the original statutes stipulated quite a big ecclesiastical foundation there, including 13 clerks and 7 choristers. So beside a commitment to safeguarding the physical well-being of its residents, the hospital since the Middle Ages has tried to cater for their spiritual and their moral health with a daily cycle of worship. Now, I was already aware that my colleague Magnus Williamson at Newcastle University had begun important work on the pre-Reformation musical foundation there, although he'd been rather hampered by the patchy nature of the archival evidence. There are a few stewards' account rolls left from the 1520s, and from that he'd managed to detect the presence of John Redford, later of St. Paul's Cathedral, London, as the master of choristers and as the organist here at St. Cross, and of course a substantial body of singers that he was paid to train and direct. But for my period, the later 16th century, almost nothing remains. The written records for St. Cross now in the Hampshire Record Office, as surprisingly intermittent. And there's a note on the parish register of 1670 that sort of tells us why. Up until that point, just prior to that point, the steward of the hospital had been a Mr. Wright, who apparently instructed his widow to burn all of his papers on his death. So we're not quite sure what he was trying to hide, but let's just say she did a very, very good job. So there are account rolls for patchy sort of clusters of years for the first half of the 16th century, which Magnus was able to use, but almost nothing for my half of the century. So I kind of made my peace with that, and the cross wouldn't be part of my story, and I got on. Then the lockdown of March 2020 hit, and of course the world stopped turning. We all stayed at home and worked from home. And it was during this time that I first stumbled across the work that Karen and her team from the Hampshire Medieval Graffiti Survey were doing. I was idly clicking on the St. Cross website on the quite fun little graffiti trail bit. And I was met with this image, which you can see on the screen. It was a real bolt out the blue to me, because this name on the left here, Walter Cheney, was actually one of my guys. He was one of the professional singers. I'd already done quite a lot of work reconstructing his life story. I knew of him. He'd been a lay singer or a professional singing man at the Winchester Cathedral from late 1583. He'd actually appeared at the cathedral as a janitor from 1580, and apparently served in both roles up until his death in 1601. He was also the uncle of William Wigthorpe, who was a chorister at Winchester, but later became a fairly minor but noted Jacobean composer. So the kind of figure who musicologists like me are interested in. And Walter Cheney's will and probate inventory survive in the Record Office in Winchester, and there's also a surviving composition by him in a manuscript in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And yet here he was in St. Cross in some capacity. So I sort of had a frenzy of Googling, and I bombarded Karen and her team with emails and requests for information, and gradually managed to put together what this represents, get some sense of what this represents. This is basically the surface of a prayer desk sitting today on the north side of the chancel at St. Cross in the church, and it bears the marks of numerous 16th century users, mostly professional clergy and professional singers. Now, I visited the church before. I walked past this very desk without even taking a second glance at it, and a number of other historians have noted it before, and actually written about it. Institutional histories mention it, and the graffiti. There are various Victorian antiquarian descriptions of it as well. But no one had really thought much about the meaning of the graffiti or the usefulness of it. Even work by the architectural historian Nicholas Ryle, who had shown basically how various desks around the building today were once part of a 16th century choir stall, which was then cut up and sort of redistributed by Victorian interior designers. Nicholas Ryle had mentioned in passing the presence of the graffiti on the desk, but made no more of it. Now, I'll just give you an aerial shot of it, which we'll zoom in on in a moment. At a basic level, the names and dates on the desk plug a gap in the archival record for me, offering at least something for the second half of the 16th century. But more importantly, they offer me a foothold for doing something with the broader documentary terrain to explore the archival records. As any archival historian will tell you, one constantly has this sense of searching for a needle in a haystack, even in the archives of a fairly small city like Winchester. But the data from this prayer desk enabled me to cross-reference with other sources, documentary sources, such as records of clergymen from other nearby churches, chapter acts, churches' financial accounts, episcopal visitation records, and of course civic documents like taxation and subsidy rolls, and probate materials as well. It also gave me a starting point for looking at some important secondary sources as well, and particularly Derek Keene's monumental 3-volume study, A Survey of Medieval Winchester, in which he basically traces the occupancy of every plot and every tenement in the medieval city over several centuries. So there isn't time today to offer you a detailed account of everything I can get from this graffiti, but we wanted to offer you a summary. First of all, it offers a snapshot of various professional clergy, adult professional singers and choristers who were present at some point in the later 16th century. Secondly, and unsurprisingly, it reveals quite close connections with the staff at nearby Winchester Cathedral. And thirdly, less expected, it shows a good deal of connections with other institutions in nearby cities as well, particularly Salisbury. And it shows some of these patterns of sort of professional human traffic between institutions across southern England. So I'm going to just first of all focus you in on the bits that I've highlighted on the screen. There are essentially on this desk two groups of markings. The first, which I've highlighted there, is a kind of rather formalized set. It's apparently all done by the same person, or at least in the same style, as a fairly sort of homogeneous group of names. And then alongside and overlaid around that are various other names and dates, all in different styles, and quite possibly, of course, all from different times. But my working hypothesis is that this initial group, it records the staff on roll at some point in the later 16th century. So I'm going to just bring you into that a little bit more closely. The top row here, it basically lists the senior clergy and the administrative staff at St. Cross. You've got from left to right, John Watson, who was the master of St. Cross from 1559 to 83, and also Bishop of Winchester from 1580 up to his death in 1583. It gives us the name of the chanter or precentor, the steward, a curate. William Lee was another clergyman, and Richard Shear was some kind of administrative figure. The lower row, on the other hand, it names 4 professional singers who presumably formed the nucleus of the choral foundation at this time. So we can go into these. So first of all, so Walter Cheney, as I've said, I've done a lot to reconstruct the career of this particular singer. He was apparently a local man, spent his entire career in the city, but was previously only known to have been active at the cathedral. To the right, Henry Kingerwood. He was also a lay vicar or professional lay singer at the cathedral from 1576 to 83. Moving along, Richard Ganiot. He was a singing man. He actually names himself as a singing man here at St. Cross and dates it to 1573. Now, interestingly, there are no known connections between Ganiot and Winchester Cathedral, but we do know that he was at Salisbury Cathedral from around 1585 right up until his death in 1624. First as a lay singer there, an unordained singer, and later actually as a vicar choral, an ordained singing man. He was also the in-house music copyist at Salisbury Cathedral, and later held a curacy in a parish church just outside the city as well. And then to the right of that, Morgan Lidford, again, a lay vicar at Winchester Cathedral from 1583 to at least 1600 when the written records break off. And it's notable that Morgan Lidford was appointed at the cathedral at exactly the same time as Walter Cheney. And of course, that's exactly the same time that the master of St. Cross, John Watson, became the bishop as well there. So perhaps he brought a couple of his favoured singers from St. Cross down the road with him. Now, presumably these 4 singers were supplemented by choristers and perhaps other more casually employed adult professional singers. And although it only provides us with a snapshot, we can get some sense of the comings and goings of singers at St. Cross through some of the other names in the other layers on this desk as well. So at the bottom there, John Atkins, he was a lay vicar at Winchester Cathedral from 1575 to 1600. At the top, Lionel Jennings was a chorister at Winchester Cathedral from 1565 to 75. And another little zoom in. On the right there, Richard Fuller, he was a lay vicar at Winchester Cathedral from 1563 to 73, later became the organist and the master of choristers at Salisbury in the 1590s. And finally, on the left, Walter Noel, who began his career as a vicar choral at Wells Cathedral in the 1540s and remained there till the 1560s. He then spent a long time at Salisbury Cathedral from the 1560s to his death in 1605. He was also the parish priest at St. Thomas Parish Church in Salisbury for a while in the 1570s. But this is the only trace we have of him actually working as a singer in Winchester. So overall, you can see we've got actually quite a lot of evidence to suggest this quite a vibrant musical foundation going on here at St. Cross. One which obviously has strong links to, but not dependent upon, the cathedral nearby. It's a community of professional singers whose paths are crossing quite regularly, both at other Winchester institutions and further afield in the region. So this is just a sort of summary slide of all of that. Now, so far, obviously, I've treated this item of furniture in isolation, and of course, it's part of a much wider body of graffiti evidence at St. Cross. In over 120 survey visits between 2016 and 19, Karen and her team have amassed over 5,000 images taken across various buildings, outbuildings, and of course, various furnishings as well. So I want to dwell just briefly on one example, and that's because it basically brings us back to where we started with Walter Cheney, the singing man. So this inscription was found in the Undercroft, in the cellar underneath the main Brethren's Hall in the St. Cross complex, which of course is a strange place for a professional singer to be found. And I guess it reminds us of something that we as musicologists often are quite, we lose sight of, that actually professional music making is very often just one strand in the lives of these people. So, I mean, we know that Cheney was the janitor at the cathedral as well as a singing man there. The fact that he's etching his name here in the Undercroft at St. Cross suggests maybe he had a broader role within that community as well. And Karen's noted the proximity of this marking with another one by one John Terry, brewer. And the Terry family, or Tirry family as it's sometimes spelt, of brewers, they occupied various premises in Kingsgate Street, which is the street that connects basically the Cathedral Close with ultimately St. Cross, in the decades either side of 1600. So it seems very much that John Terry, the brewer, was part of that clan. And it's worth also noting that presumably his kinsmen, Michael Terry and Thomas Terry, had also scratched their names onto the same prayer desk that we've been looking at. And of course, whilst it's hard to draw concrete conclusions from this kind of evidence, what it seems to suggest to me, at least, is that Walter Cheney had a broader role around the place. Perhaps he was helping with moving and storing goods, and that he was interacting in various ways with his near neighbours, the Terrys. And of course, it's further research into questions like this, where we're able to cross-reference graffiti evidence with other kinds of archival record. It will undoubtedly lead us towards a much clearer picture of everyday trade and wider cultural practices, both in St. Cross and also in its wider urban context. Now, of course, this kind of graffiti evidence obviously has its limitations. This particular prayer desk, it gives us names, occasionally it gives us dates, it gives us nothing concrete about the functions of these men, or of course the chronology of their markings. But nonetheless, it does confirm the presence of professional singers during a period that is otherwise blank in the documentary record. From the dates carved, from what I've been able to find out about these singers' careers so far, it strongly suggests a cluster of activity around the 1570s and 1580s. And that's interesting in itself. This is supposedly a period of decline in the provision of church music, if you follow the sort of traditional narrative of Elizabethan worship, the historiography on that. So actually it suggests, certainly here at least, there was quite a well-resourced musical provision in place at St. Cross. And it lends further weight to Magnus Williamson's observation that St. Cross was essentially functioning as a kind of de facto episcopal residence at the time. If we look back to those words I've begun with as well from William Panton, I think this prayer desk and the graffiti on it, they allow us to merge archaeological and documentary evidence in a way of which he probably would have been quite pleased, I hope. And of course, there's one other sort of overriding moral to the story, and that is this. I mean, please publish and publicize all the photos that you're taking widely, because of course, of the hundreds and thousands of photos that you're accumulating, you may already be holding that elusive missing piece to somebody else's puzzle, just as Karen was for mine. So anyway, thank you.